Welcome to Testaments with Jerry. Our collection of oral stories transforms written memories into heartfelt recordings, capturing the voices and experiences of remarkable people who wanted to share their journeys with friends, family, and loved ones. Our goal is to preserve these memories in a way that feels alive, allowing listeners to hear the warmth, wisdom, and individuality of each person's life. We also include end-of-life interviews that honor individuals' reflections and help keep their voices alive for generations to come. My name is Jerry Flanagan, and this is part one of an abridged version of The Autobiography of an Irish Traveller, detailing the author's Irish homeland and travels around the globe, including time spent in America during the Revolutionary War period. Walter Brabazon's 1835 narrative stands as a seminal work, tracing a journey from an orphan childhood in Ireland to service as a military official during America's Whiskey Rebellion, and ultimately to life in Siberia. At its core, the text explores a nomadic worldview that regards even permanent dwellings as temporary stopping places, framing travel as the primary means of understanding existence. Scholars recognize this account as a rare, authentic voice of the Irish traveller community, a historically marginalized peripatetic group whose story was long documented only through the lens of outsiders.
The Autobiography of an Irish Traveller, Volume 1, Origins, Exile, and the American Frontier. Chapter 1, The Disconsolate Wanderer. I was born in Ireland, an island that nature had intended to be fertile, rich, and populous. Yet, looking upon the faces of my countrymen, I saw only the reflection of a land rendered poor and miserable by the narrow and oppressive policies of our powerful neighbour, Great Britain. As a young man, the weight of these calamities filled my heart with a constant, aching sorrow. Seeking to escape the melancholy that settled over my spirit, I resolved to tour my own country, hoping that movement might dissipate my painful reflections. However, I was deeply mistaken. Everywhere I wandered, from the smallest townland to the largest parish, I discovered the same wretchedness and destitution that had wounded my feelings at home. It was during these disconsolate journeys that I conceived a grander design. I would travel into foreign countries. I wished to study their governments, their laws, and their manners, with the aspiration of eventually publishing the result of my observations for the benefit of civilization. I possessed what many have called a nomadic mindset, an outlook on life where travel is not merely the act of moving from one point to another, but a lens through which one views the entire world. To me, work, accommodation, and education were all seen in a different light. I began to view a permanent house not as a home, but merely as a stopping place or a winter camp. Even when I was not physically moving, I retained the spirit of a nomad, realizing that travelers remain travelers even when they are sedentary. To facilitate this journey, I sought the cooperation of my guardian, a man of competent fortune and a gallant seaman who had seen every quarter of the globe. It was often joked that though he had been round the world, he had never truly been in it, yet his enlarged knowledge of mankind made him the perfect associate for my trek into the unknown. My patrimonial estate was situated near the town of Clonmel, in the wild rocky glens of the Slunamusk Mountains. While I awaited his reply from Belfast, I spent my days roaming these romantic falls, with an angling rod, catching salmon and trout to kill the tedious interval. I watched the gaudy carriages of the wealthy roll by, contrasting their cushions with the misery of those dragging themselves along the road on foot. Little did I know that my nomadic destiny was about to be forged by an encounter on those very roads. Chapter 2, The Tragedy of Tom Bryan. One fine morning, while fishing down the stream near Gooling Bridge, I resigned my tackle and began the leisurely walk home. Near the separation of the road to Waterford, my attention was arrested by a poor man seated on a green bank. His head leaned upon his hand, absorbed in a thought so deep, he seemed oblivious to the world. Though his garments were those of a beggar, his countenance was haggard and melancholy, yet his features bespoke a man who had once belonged to a more respectable class. Hoping to inquire into his situation, I slipped a piece of silver into his hand. The poor fellow lifted his eyes to heaven, invoking the blessings of the Almighty upon me for the bread my assistance would buy. This man was Tom Bryan. He confessed to me with a trembling tear that he intended to quit his native land, for his misfortunes on the soil of Ireland had become too weighty to bear. Yet, he assured me his devotion to old Erin remained fervent. He was, in his own words, a wicked and unfortunate being, but not a hardened sinner. He had repented of his rashness and suffered great penitence. Deeply affected, I conveyed him to my home upon a passing cart of oats, promising him the food and repose his exhausted frame required. The next morning, nourished and rested, Tom permitted me to unburden his sorrows. He was born of respectable parents in County Cork, where his father held a lease that had descended through 3 generations. Their ruin was orchestrated by the lord of the manor, a haughty, proud, and avaricious man who became their implacable enemy. Because Tom's father held influence at elections, this inhuman monster purchased their lease, exploited a legal flaw to cancel it, and procured a bill of ejectment. The legal battle lasted 3 years, stripping my guest's father of his fortune. Just before they were driven from their land like beggars, Tom's mother died of grief. The Lord, unsatisfied by their ruin, even came to chastise the old man, declaring that the family's misery afforded him more gratification than £20,000. This fiendish conduct filled Tom's breast with a rancorous hatred that awaited only the opportunity for rage. Chapter 3. Vengeance and Flight. Tom's desire for revenge tormented him day and night, making him sullen even to his friends. He secretly resolved to give the wretch a sound cudgeling, and cut himself a stout oaken sapling for the purpose. On a beautiful mild day, while whistling a tune on the high road 3 miles from the manor, he saw the lord approaching on horseback with a servant. Burning with the remembrance of his family's wrongs, Tom stood in the narrow road and cried, "Villain, I shall now take my revenge." The lord fired a pistol, the ball grazing Tom's ribs, but before a second shot could be used, Tom seized the horse's bridle. With a well-directed blow of his cudgel to the temple, he brought the man lifeless to the ground. Panic-stricken, Tom jumped upon the lord's full-blooded hunter, overtook the fleeing servant, and forced him at gunpoint to rifle his master's pockets. They found a watch and £540 in bank bills. However, Tom was no common thief. He handed the money to the servant and instructed him to deliver it to the master's heirs so they could not be called thieves. It was only later that Tom revealed the hidden cause of his fury. He had loved a woman by the name of Helen Burnett, but the lord had maliciously ruined Tom's reputation to force Helen into a marriage with his own nephew. Helen had died of a broken heart shortly after being forced to the altar, a catastrophe that pushed Tom to his fatal act. Tom's flight was harrowing. He and the servant encountered the outlaw gang of Tim Lawson in the forest. Tom shrewdly assumed an air of defiance, leading the outlaws to believe he was a novice of their own trade. He bribed the leader with 2 £50 bills to secure safe passage for the servant to Limerick. Afterward, Tom sought refuge in a turf cutter's hut on the edge of a great bog. Though he was pursued by the county cavalry, the turf cutter's family, who had once lived on his father's bounty, hid him faithfully. Tom even sold the lord's horse, claiming it belonged to Lawson, to provide for the impoverished widow. He eventually fell ill with bog fever and was nearly murdered by Lawson's returning gang, but the widow defended him until he could return to me. My guardian and I resolved to take Tom to the United States for his safety. Chapter 4. The New York Emporium. We embarked on a Swedish vessel of 600 tons. The passage was fraught with difficulty, as we lost our mainmast due to the captain's negligence, retarding our journey by 8 days. During this time, I began to learn the art of practical seamanship, reefing and steering alongside the first officer. On the 42nd day, we made the coast of America. It was the month of May, and as we sailed through the Narrows, nature was in her best attire. A lively verdure brightened the shores, and the fragrance of blooming flowers filled our senses with delight. We landed in New York, a city built of brick by Dutch emigrants, which I found to be the true emporium of foreign commerce. Tom Bryan, now recovered in health and spirit, decided to remain there to study law. My guardian and I, however, proceeded west toward Pennsylvania, where I was to study at the University of Philadelphia. Traveling by stagecoach through New Jersey, I observed the red and black slate of the hills and the fields of fine wheat. I was immediately struck by the contrast in agricultural habits. In Ireland, the peasant is degraded, but here the soil was a virgin treasure, rich and luxuriant. However, I noted that American agriculture was often carelessly pursued. Because labor was so dear, farmers often undertook more than their families could manage, leading to negligent cultivation. My guardian remarked that unless a landowner was willing to eat, drink, and work in the fields with his laborers, he would soon find himself bankrupt. I was shocked by the boorishness of the common people, who seemed to conceive their independence invaded if they stooped to the smallest act of politeness. It was a land of industry, yes, but one where the pride of wealth was already beginning to divide the orders of society. Chapter 5. The Election at Bristol. As we journeyed toward Philadelphia, we reached the town of Bristol, situated on the high banks of the Delaware River. Hearing that an election for the state legislature was to be held the next day, I prevailed upon my guardian to stop so that we might witness the proceedings. The tavern was a hurly-burly of activity. The landlord had been hired by a candidate to provide $500 worth of liquor to entice voters. He explained with a grin that country blades would drink with both candidates and often get too drunk to remember for whom they were supposed to vote. The scene that followed was one of profound drunkenness and vulgarity, exceeding even the wildest fares of Ireland. The candidates, dressed coarsely like the voters, harangued the mob with violent invectives, abusing not only the political principles, but the private characters of their opponents. I listened as one man, a former member of the Assembly, confessed that the frenzy of democracy often led to gross ignorance. He recounted an instance where a solemn-looking farmer in the legislature had mistaken a trespass law about hogs for a personal insult. By the time the poll closed, the victor was as drunk as a man could be. The room was a little hell upon earth, filled with roaring, singing, and fighting. Several men had fallen from their chairs and lay grunting on the floor like the very animals they had been legislating about. My guardian noticed my marked disapprobation. "I thought to have found more virtue in a newborn republic," I told him. He reminded me that the heroes of the democratic school were never satisfied until they threw off all restraint, mistaking license for liberty. Even here, among the plainest sects like the Quakers, the power of wealth was the only true distinction. As my American friend Callanan later observed, America's survival seemed to lie in borrowing from the solid, monarchical institutions of Great Britain. Chapter 6. The Ligonier Valley Palace. While in Philadelphia, my guardian received letters from Ireland with remarkable news. The elder brother of my cousin Donovan had died, leaving him a large estate. We resolved to seek him out in the western country, and I was given leave to go ahead to surprise him. I started on horseback, traveling leisurely to examine the country. After crossing the Susquehanna and passing through Carlisle and Bedford, I finally reached the beautiful Ligonier. The valley was a picturesque landscape of meandering rivers and waterfalls. As I rounded a verdant grove, I beheld a very handsome wooden house with a row of columns, built with such taste that I described it as a palace. I found a gentleman sitting on a turf bank, enjoying the breeze. It was Donovan. When I revealed myself as Walter Brabazon, he clasped me in his arms with a paroxysm of joy, for my father had been like a father to him when he was left unprotected. The most profound moment of our reunion occurred when I shared the news of Catholic emancipation in Ireland. Donovan sprang from his chair crying, "Erin, old Erin forever," while tears rolled down his cheeks. He immediately summoned his Irish labourers and Patrick, his head workman, to drink a noggin of whiskey to the success of their native land. Patrick, whose eloquence was irresistible, remarked that while emancipation was a glorious beginning, the abolition of tithes must follow to truly relieve the poor. Donovan, though prosperous in the backwoods, still mourned the misery and wretchedness of Ireland. I handed him the copy of his brother's will, which left everything to him and his daughter Ellen, and he marveled at how good sometimes springs out of evil. Chapter 7. Crossing the Blue Ridge. The period I spent in the Ligonier Valley was a profound interlude of domestic joy that immediately preceded the rigors of my military service. While in Philadelphia, I had requested to be admitted into a volunteer troop of cavalry, having previously served in such a capacity during my earlier residence in that city. My guardian, ever mindful of my desires, managed the timing of my enlistment with great care so that I was not expected to join the army until I had first paid a visit to my cousin Donovan. My time for repose in Ligonier was short. I had requested to be admitted into a volunteer troop of cavalry, and I was soon appointed Deputy Quartermaster General. Our mission was to quell the Western insurrection, historically known as the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794. The Whiskey Rebellion was a violent uprising by Pennsylvania farmers protesting the first federal excise tax on distilled spirits. I sighed as I took leave of Donovan's happy family and moved toward headquarters, passing through a gloomy forest of white pines where the sun's rays never penetrated. Our march across the Blue Ridge was one of the most extraordinary experiences of my military life. In a single 15-mile stretch, we witnessed the change of all 4 seasons. At the summit in October, we were covered in deep snow and the severity of winter. Yet, as we descended the southern side, we found the verdure of spring adorned with raspberries and strawberries. Reaching the plains below, we found autumnal fruits still ripening on the branches. The campaign, however, soon became a dismal struggle against nature. Scarcely had we advanced onto the low ground when we were assailed by bad weather. We were encamped on a flat surrounded by forests, and the rain fell in such quantities that we had to dig canals around our huts, or bush houses, to keep from being inundated. We were drenched to the skin for 8 days, with little to eat but bread and brandy. This life of scarcity and exposure brought on a painful disease. Several of our corps suffered from swellings and gatherings that required the bone to be lanced and scraped. Many of my brave companions met with an untimely grave in that muddy wilderness before the insurrection was finally subdued. Editor note, most likely osteomyelitis, which is an infection of the bone. Chapter 8. The Military Savage. Following the conquest of the rebellion, I had the opportunity to visit a truly eccentric character, Major Semple. He was a former American officer who had chosen a secluded, fortified existence in the Ohio forests, shunning both civilized and savage society. Living with his Indian family in a fortified log house, he had rejected democracy as an absurdity, asserting that the patriarchal form of government was the only one dictated by nature. He viewed himself as a military savage, living free from the malice of civilization. The Major invited our party on a buffalo hunt, instructing us in the cunning tactics of the frontier. He warned us that we must keep perfectly silent and remain leeward of the prey, for their sense of smell was exquisite. We crawled forward on all fours, concealed by trees and patches of snow. Semple himself was a formidable hunter who could shoot a squirrel through the head. He taught me to watch for the sentinel, leader bull, who stands erect to keep watch while the rest of the herd feeds. We managed to take down several heifers, but had to reload instantly to deter an attack from the enraged animals, who are more fierce than bears. Our journey concluded as I received intelligence that my father had died, and I was ordered back to Ireland to secure my inheritance from a cousin who sought to usurp it. Our return voyage across the Atlantic was perilous. A severe storm near the Irish coast saw the captain fail in his duty through cowardice. My guardian and I were forced to help pilot the vessel, and we eventually anchored safely in Dublin Bay. Thus ended my first transatlantic odyssey, as I returned home to fight for the rights that had been stolen in my absence.
This ends Part 1 of the Autobiography of an Irish Traveller. Parts 2 and 3 will follow. If you are interested in learning how to revitalize the memory of a forgotten loved one by sharing a short written memoir or autobiography here on this platform, please drop us a message and follow us. Thank you for listening.